What's up, everybody? Today we are going to be dropping the 370Z with BC Coilovers. I was definitely not planning on doing this as soon as I am. I didn't think I was going to be dropping the 370Z for at least a year or so because I had some other projects in the works. However, I did find an amazing deal on these lightly used BC Coilovers. These things have about 10,000 miles on them. I was able to snag them for a little over $500. They are almost in perfect condition. Of course, they are used, so they do have some soot and dirt already on them. But for the most part, everything feels good on them. The owner said that the shocks are still in great shape. There's nothing wrong with them. Did of course get the tools and everything to go with it. The collars still feel like they are pretty loose. Should be easy to throw these on there. But enough chatter, guys. I really want to get these things on, so I'm going to walk you guys through the process of how to install coilovers on the Z. Alright guys, so we're going to start with the front coilovers, and the first thing we need to do is remove this center strut brace here so that we can access the strut hat, which sits underneath just right there if you can see it. We need to remove 3 14mm bolts from either side, as well as some other trimming and some bolts at the back. Alright guys, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get a jack underneath the control arm here to be able to hold up the weight of the rotor as well as the knuckles and other parts of the suspension members. Because when we remove the strut, the whole thing's going to want to drop out, so we want something holding it. So we'll go ahead and get a jack under there.
Next, you'll want to remove the 3 nuts from the top of the strut. You'll want to be careful not to lose these nuts in the engine bay, otherwise you'll have to go digging for it.
Alright, so the top of the strut is now going to be free. It's only being held up right now, of course, by the jack. That's why we put that in place. Before you take the strut out, you're going to want to remove any of the brake lines that are attached to the strut, so that way we can pull it out freely. So kind of just set those out of the way. Be careful not to snag these when you're pulling the strut out, because you don't want to start bleeding fluid everywhere. Also go ahead and undo this bolt to be able to free this part of the brake line as well. Alright guys, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to undo the 3/4 nut right here. This one's probably going to be on pretty tight, guys, so you might need a torque wrench, or I'm going to be using an impact. But we need to take that off so that way we can slide the connecting piece here with the anti-roll bar. There is also a bolt on the other side that I've got a wrench attached to keep the boot here from getting stressed. So you want to make sure you hold on to that. Don't let the bolt that's on this side twist, otherwise you could possibly rip the boot here on this connecting arm. So we'll go ahead and take the nut out now.
And for this I did end up using a breaker bar because of how torqued down the nut was. With a screwdriver and a mallet or hammer, you're going to want to also tap this bolt backwards a little bit to be able to free the bottom of the strut. You may not be able to tap it all the way through just because the control arm is going to be holding it in place, but you just need to get it far back enough so that we can slide the strut out a little bit easier. You'll then want to remove the 3 bolts that are holding on this black retaining plate here. That way you can free the strut. I've found that getting to the 2 bolts closer to the rotor is easier if you turn the steering wheel opposite of the direction that you're looking at. That way you can get over the steering arm here a little bit easier and have a little more room to work. And at this point you will want to pull the bottom of the strut sideways and out of the car. When you're doing so, make sure you don't snag on the brake lines because you don't want to rip them. And at this point you want to make sure that the 2 coilovers are set to the same height for the front. They should already be set by default from the factory to the recommended height from BC. You can go back and adjust the ride height later, but for now we just want to make sure that the 2 front coilovers are even. Here I ended up cleaning out the threads a little bit and then made some adjustments to the height to ensure that both of the front coilovers were at the same height and that they looked to be approximately at the height that I was going to want. I will make a separate video detailing how to adjust the ride height on these, but I'm assuming most of you will be installing new coilovers, so you should be able to just throw these directly into the car. The next step will be to maneuver the coilovers into the car where the old strut was situated at. These coilovers will have approximately the same shape as the standard OEM parts that came with the car. You do want to make sure that you maneuver the coilovers around the brake lines and the speed sensor line just as the OEM parts were, that way you can reposition these lines later. While holding the coilover up, you might also want to go ahead and thread the 3 nuts loosely on the top of the hat, that way it can hold the coilover in place.
What we do here is go back.
And then you'll want to reinstall all of the nuts and bolts that you removed, starting with the center one that holds the bottom of the strut, as well as the 3 bolts here that hold on the retaining plate for the strut. And then you're going to want to reinstall, of course, all of the clips that hold on the brake lines. And you want to make sure that all of these brake lines have plenty of clearance. You don't want them rubbing on anything. If you notice any fraying, you may end up wanting to insulate it as well, because you don't want to get a crack in your brake line and start leaking brake fluid. I ended up wrapping it in some electrical tape. This is not what I recommend you do, but unfortunately it's all I had at the moment. I'll have to return to these later on to be able to make some repairs. And with the coilovers reinstalled in the car and the brake lines reattached, you will just want to go back and retighten all of the bolts that we ended up loosening. It is usually recommended to tighten these things down to factory specifications, however I ended up just hand tightening everything, so I'm going to go back and readjust and retighten things later. You will also want to make sure you tighten the collars on the coilover to make sure that the car doesn't adjust its height on its own. You can do this by first tightening the bottom one, by moving the collar to the left side. This will tighten it into the bottom sleeve, and then you will want to tighten the 2 top collars as well by threading them into each other. That means moving the bottom collar over to the right and the top collar over to the left. You will then want to go ahead and reinstall the wheels back on the car. I ended up noticing that the wheel gap was a bit more narrow than what I was looking for with the car raised in the air, so I ended up going back and readjusting everything again.
Alright guys, and that is it for the installation of the front coilovers, and I've already gone ahead and put the tires back on the car. Now we are going to move and do the rears, which are fortunately a lot easier than the fronts. In fact, we only have to remove a total of 4 bolts. We're going to remove this one here at the bottom of the strut, as well as 2 that are hiding up at the top of the strut. Then we should be able to take this out. Before we do that, we are going to support the bottom of the control arm with a jack, so that way when we pop this bolt right here, we will be able to lower this down slowly and safely to be able to remove this spring and then replace it with the new coilovers.
With those first 3 bolts removed, the 2 at the top and the one holding the bottom of the strut, you should be able to remove the strut from the car now. I ended up finding it easier to go ahead and let the jack down because the friction in some of the connecting points here actually held this hat and spring up in place. So once you let the jack down, that should take the pressure off of the strut and you should be able to remove the strut from the vehicle. At this point, we'll go ahead and remove this 4th bolt here to be able to free the spring. Now the friction at the rear connecting point is going to hold this hat in place and want to prevent you from removing the spring. You just have to press down firmly on it to be able to get the spring loose to be able to remove it. Also, don't forget to remove the top hat of the spring here. And here I ended up making some adjustments to the ride height to be able to ensure that the left and right side of the vehicle were at the same height. These should already be set for you from the factory, no need to make any adjustments here. I will go over how to adjust the ride height on these in a later video. Go ahead and reinstall all of the bolts back from where you got them. This should be fairly self-explanatory, and then you'll complete the installation on the rear.
Alright guys, and it is a couple days later now. The coilovers are now installed on the 370Z, and I actually got really lucky because the car is sitting at exactly the ride height that I was going for. I was going for around a 1.5 inch drop or so, and that's exactly where the car ended up sitting after I finished installing everything, so I guess I estimated the settings just about correct. But that's not normal. Normally, you'll set the car down, and then you'll find that the ride height is not where you want it to be. Either the front or the back will be slightly raised, and you'll have to go in and adjust the coilovers to try and get the car to sit level. You may end up wanting to raise it, you may end up wanting to lower it. I'll show you guys how to do that shortly because I am probably going to need to make some adjustments anyways. There are some things that I have noticed. For instance, the camber on the rear I can tell is already off. You may not be able to tell just in the picture here, but if you look up in the wheel arch, there is a huge gap that's kind of formed in here. The top of the tire is recessed really far back because I do have some negative camber going on. So I'll probably end up needing to get some camber arms to try and fix the alignment. And then we'll need to probably adjust the ride height because I suspect I may end up rubbing on some things just based on the fact that the exhaust and the aluminum splash guard are sitting so low right now. I'm thinking that those are probably going to end up bumping on the freeway whenever I hit bumps or whatever. And I apologize if y'all are picking up a lot of wind noise right now in the microphone. I am on top of a parking garage, and it has been nothing but windy and cold the past couple of weeks here in Texas. It's like 37 degrees, which I know isn't cold by most standards in most states, but here in Texas we just have hoodies, we don't really have jackets, so I'm really cold right now. But as I said, I am really happy with the ride height on the car right now. It is sitting pretty much exactly where I would like it to stay at. Some adjustments may be needed just to keep the car from scraping on things. I'm actually surprised now that I've had a couple of days to drive it, how comfortable the ride is on this. In fact, it almost feels as comfortable as the stock suspension does. I was surprised that it didn't feel that much stiffer. When I installed suspension on my Sentra, the ride was a huge difference. It was really stiff. I wouldn't say it was uncomfortable to ride in, but I know that any of my passengers were not having a fun time riding with me because the suspension was that stiff. But in this thing, I actually wouldn't be embarrassed to take somebody out with me. The coilovers are actually fairly comfortable. Again, I may need to stiffen them up though, just to keep them from scraping. But I am really surprised at just how well the suspension dynamics works on this car. It is, of course, completely different from my Sentra, how the suspension is set up and everything. The coilovers installed on this thing feel much more natural than they did in the Sentra. Overall, of course, I am really happy with these coilovers. And of course, the car is way more responsive. This is why I got these coilovers in the first place, guys. The suspension feels amazing on this thing right now. The responsiveness is just insane. I'll do a more in-depth review on this later, but I do love these coilovers, guys. I am really happy that I installed them. I hope you found this video informative. If you did, give it the thumbs up. You can also subscribe to my channel for more how-to videos on the 370Z. Thank you guys for watching, and I will see y'all in the next video. Later.